Hi, do you work here?
Sure do.
I got a question about these powders. This one's a lot faster than this one. I'm loading for 223. Which one of these do you think would be better?
223 is so inaccurate, it just really doesn't matter.
What the fuck? Old man Taylor, coming to you from the reloading bench. Today's topic is going to be load development from the very beginning all the way to the end. What are we loading today? How are we going to pick our powders? How are we going to pick our bullets, projectiles? And how are we going to put all that together, go through our load development process, and end up with the cartridge that we intended? Let's talk about what we're loading today. So the intent is 223 bolt action with a long barrel for distance. We're going to be making a load to shoot about 600 yards is our intent. But we want it to group pretty well at 100 as well. That's kind of a tricky thing to do. Before we get deep into this process, I got to address one elephant that's in the room. That is 5.56 versus 2.23. As hand loaders, what matters? Can I make the same recipes and work in both rifles? Yes, the answer is yes. I don't want to get into a big debate. I could do a whole video on the differences between the two, or really what's the similarities between the two, because they are very similar. When we're talking about the hand loader, there really isn't much difference. When we go to find powder loads, recipes from manufacturers, that's typically where we actually see a difference. The difference is going to be really in the way that the pressures are measured between the two. They're just not apples and apples. They're measured with different techniques. So we've got a SAMI specified load for 223, and most of our load data is going to show that information. If we're shooting this in a chamber that is marked 5.56, all 223 loads will be safe in that. But we might see a slightly higher pressure in 5.56 if we measure it the same way that we measure 223. But the barrel lengths and the chamber size and a few other things will even vary that somewhat. So like I said, it's just not apples to apples. We're measuring different things in 5.56. We may find our manufacturers are giving us load data for service rifle. We might see that that's a slightly higher pressure than what we see for the SAMI 223. In that case, what our manufacturers are doing is they're attempting to meet a pressure measured the same way as SAMI that they believe is still safe in a 5.56, but using the SAMI method. And that's about 6,000 to 7,000 PSI higher than the SAMI information, all right? So I just want to get that out there. When we start looking at load recipes in this particular caliber, we may see some very different things from the same manufacturers listed, because one is listed as 223 SAMI, and it may not even say SAMI, and the other is going to be maybe service rifle or 5.56, and it's going to be a slightly higher pressure. What's safe in my rifle? My rifle is marked 223, which means it is not safe for 5.56. So I'm going to use that 223 load data. If I decide to exceed that a little bit, I'm going to do that very carefully, walking up, looking for my pressure signs. Do not recommend you do that. To borrow a little bit of JRB, you'll blow your face off. Don't do that. Stick to the book. In this load development, we're going to be running pretty close to book information where there exists book information. A little bit of this, there is no book information, and we're going to have to do our very best to have a safe load and to work up as we move through that challenge. So let's talk about the steps for load development. The very first step in load development is establishing what I'm trying to achieve. What is the purpose and what is a successful load? Otherwise, I don't know when I'm done. I'm going to keep going until I can shoot every single bullet into the same hole at an infinite distance. It's just not possible, right? So we need to define what is our goal, okay? And in my case, the goal is going to be taking a bolt action rifle, shooting well under 1 MOA at 100 yards, and holding as close to an MOA at 600 yards as I can. Now that's a challenge for a 223. So I will accept 1.5 MOA at 600 yards. That's the goal with large groups, right? That's our goal. So now we've defined what the goal is. The next thing we want to do is start picking powders and projectiles. Now I'm gonna share with you my version of that. There are lots of versions. Many of them are absolutely legitimate. They're just not what I'm doing. So I'm gonna share with you what I am actually doing. I have decided that, and I've tried a lot of different methods. I've decided that the method that I'm gonna use is I'm gonna start with choosing my projectile. I'm gonna pick a projectile, one projectile, and I'm gonna try different powders in that to find that. If it doesn't work, we try a new projectile and we move on. But here's why I do that. I did it the other way in the past where you start with multiple projectiles and a few powders and try to make it work. What I found is I've got little boxes of 100 bullets with some of them shot sitting in my cabinet that will be there until I die and my kids have to deal with it. Because I'm never going to shoot them again. They failed. But I bought a box of 100 and I tried them and they didn't work and I moved on to something else. Meanwhile, I've got a bunch of powders that work really well in multiple rifles. And we'll talk about that when we get to powder selection. So I've got a bunch of powder sitting on the shelf. I find that it's a lot easier to try different powders with the projectile that's going to do what I want it to do. And I have much, much better results. And the failures are still powders I'll use for something else. So I keep a pound or so of just about everything that fits in this burn rate that I want. So with that in mind, what I'm choosing is a projectile that I've actually already developed a load for. What's that about? Well, the load that I developed for this is in a powder that I can't replace anymore. And to be honest, it didn't get a full workup. It didn't get all of these powders tested. I just tested one or two and got a result I was fairly happy with. But I can't buy that powder anymore. So now I've got to replace it. And I'm going to do this proper. I'm going to go through all of the powders that I have, and I'm going to do a little more thorough load development than I did the first time because I want a better result than I had the first time. It wasn't quite acceptable, and I just didn't get around to finding the correct load. So what is that projectile that I'm loading today? These are Sierra Match King 77 grains. This particular projectile is the same projectile that's used in the military's Mark 262. And that's one of the reasons I chose it, because I know that it works very well. That particular cartridge uses the 77 SMKs, and it uses it for two different applications. One of them is short barrel gas guns. The heavier projectile with the reduced velocity from the short barrel gives better terminal performance than the lighter military ball round that they were using. That's one application. That's not my application. The other application is their longer range precision marksman out to about 600 yards is what this projectile's second main reason that it's used. Well, that matches what I'm trying to do. The BC on these Sierra Match Kings should perform fairly well at 600 yards. The G1 on these is 372. The G7 is 182. So we've got a pretty high BC projectile, not the highest that there is, but these are very proven, and that's why we choose the 77 SMKs. In full transparency, I purchased this box of 77 SMKs when I started this video, and I started shooting them. Since then, Sierra has replaced them and more. So I am going to be shooting projectiles provided by Sierra. Just want to be very clear about that. They're not paying me. They just provided me more of their projectiles to use. I'm also going to be shooting that in Lapua brass. This Lapua brass I also purchased. But since then, Lapua has agreed to provide me with some fresh brass. So I will be using some Lapua brass throughout this video, would have anyway, but they have agreed to provide me some, and I just wanted to be clear that that was happening. One other thing that's happened since I've spoken to you last, I bought the pound of N135 that you're going to see me shoot at the range, and VV has agreed to provide me a couple pounds of N135. So we'll be using some of their powder as well, and you'll see some of their powder in the future videos. Just for clarity, wanted to provide that information. Let's talk about how we're going to pick the powders. I've got 5 sitting here. You can pretty much guess these are the ones that I'm taking to the range. But let me tell you how I figured that out, okay? That's one of our challenges as loaders, is trying to figure out which powders to even try. I'm going to put up my powder burn rate chart here, and this is just a chunk of it. It's the chunk that really applies to 223 pretty well. N540 is the last one that just got cut off in the picture, but that would be the slowest on this particular chart. Okay, so when we're looking at all these powders and their burn rates, with fastest being at the top, slowest at the bottom, there's a couple factors that come into play here. One is the case volume versus bore diameter. If there's a ratio that happens there, and we can kind of figure out that any cartridge that has a similar ratio tends to kind of like the similar burn rates. That's why the 223 and the 308 share so many powders, because that ratio is the same. That's why. Now, when we're looking at our specific example that we're trying to load for, we've got to also calculate the distance from inside the bore, the length of the barrel, for instance. So if we look at that, we've got a ratio that exists between the case capacity and the entire case capacity plus the volume inside that bore, so the diameter times its length, okay? And we don't have to actually do all this math, but we can look at a basic standard, you know, that SAMI standard, kind of figure out which powder is right for that, and then adjust it based on our particular needs. You've seen me load a lot of 308, but in that 308, I've got a short barrel. I'm a 20-inch barrel. So I'm a little shorter than that SAMI spec or all those printed data from our manufacturers. They're typically 24, sometimes 26. Right? But I'm definitely shorter than that, so I need a slightly faster powder than what would be standard for a standard rifle. This one that we're loading for today is a 26-inch barrel, so it's a little bit longer than our standard 24, which means my powder needs to be just a touch slower than a typical 223 load. So I'm moving down my powder burn rate chart, fastest to slowest. I'm moving out of those really fast powders, and I'm working a little closer to the slow because of the size of my bore. Well, then the next thing is, how about the projectile, weight of that projectile? And it's really a bearing surface and a few other things, but we can use weight as a general rule of thumb. How heavy is that compared to the standard for that particular caliber? Well, if we look at the SAMI, you know, typically we run 55 to 62 grain in a 1 in 12 twist barrel. Well, I'm running a 1 in 7 twist, and I'm going to 77. So I'm running a heavier projectile with more twists in my barrel. That's also going to call for a slightly slower powder than that typical SAMI standard. So I've got two things that are adding together for 223 that are telling me a little bit slower than standard. That puts me very firmly into my 308 short barrel loads. So that's why you're seeing a lot of the same powders again. And that's not an accident, of course. When I do that and I look at my burn rates, I can see the let me put these powders in order. So in our burn rate, we're going to go with TAC being our fastest. We're going to have our IMR 4895 after that. Right next to that is N135. Right after that is going to be N140. And the slowest powder we're going to try is Varget. I've got to figure out which one of these is going to give me, because I'm shooting 600 yards. SD is going to matter. If I'm only shooting 100 yards as my normal load, I can kind of ignore the SD a little bit. But I'm going to 600, so I need a pretty solid SD. So that's going to be one of the things I'm trying to nail down. Which one of these burns very cleanly and consistently, and really consistent is the key to all of this. I need a very good SD. I'm talking about on velocity. I need my velocities to be very similar shot to shot to shot. So I'm going to test these and see which of those gives me the better result. That tells me that that combination in my rifle is working very well. At 100 yards, it's just not as critical. I really am going to be concerned about my groups at 100 yards in repeatability. We're going to look at a few ideas to figure that out. And one other thing that I'm concerned with is I'm not a competition shooter going to F class and changing my charge based on the environment that I'm shooting in on this particular match. Hey, F class guys do that, okay? I'm not doing that. What I want to be able to do is figure out this load, regardless of the time of year that it is, take it out when I want to shoot, and know that I'm going to hit in the same spot or very, very similar, regardless of the change in weather. Now, there is obviously extremes where that won't apply. If I develop this load in the middle of Florida in the spring or fall, and I decide to try this in the desert or the Arctic, it's not going to work. But if I'm going in that 35 degree range up to 95, I should be able to get a pretty similar result. And if you want to see what these gunpowders do in those extreme temperature ranges, by the way, I do have a video on that. Check out Hot and Cold. It's on my channel, and I run several of these powders at very extreme colds and hots. Check that out if you haven't seen it. I want to get a load that is, quote, what's Tim say over at Crow? Not finicky. I like that term. Not finicky, okay? That's really what we're after. And the way that we're going to do that is I'm going to load 10 shots of each one of these powders. So I'm going to have a total of 50 shots. That's what we've got sitting here. And I'm going to shoot all 10 at the same target. Now this is my first step in my load development, and this is going to give me a couple pieces of information. It's not going to help me with my SD at all. But what it is going to do, I'm going to run the chronograph, and it's going to give me the speed that each one of those steps in my ladder, and it's going to be the ladder the book gives me, where the book information is available. And it's going to show me what to expect at each one of those charges. What's it going to do in my rifle with my brass, okay? This brass is not virgin brass. That's the other thing. Once again, I've got a video on new versus once fired brass. You got to have fire form brass when you start this process, or your results will change after your first firing. We're going to see what that does. What does that give me speed-wise, so I know what to expect? Shooting 600 yards, I've got some ideas on what I want to see speed-wise, and I got to make sure that my powder that I choose is going to deliver that. The other thing that it's going to do, it's going to give me a 10-shot group, and I'll be able to see what the spread in velocity is doing in that target. Obviously, this is not scientifically significant, but it'll give me an idea. If I throw a shot that's way out there and it's in the middle of that group, I know that group probably is not going to be terribly stable. But if I get a bunch of shots that kind of come together in a similar group, all linked together in velocity in that step, that is going to be a non-finicky load. And of course, when I shoot that in groups, it'll open up. We can't expect one shot to represent the entire thing. But if they all tend to kind of group together very close for a particular range of loads, we know that a little bit colder, a little bit hotter, that would have made a difference. They would have all been roughly in the same spot. So that's what we're looking for. We don't want to see a big ragged group. We want to see a fairly tight group with lots of overlaying shots at 100 yards. That's what we're going to load. Okay, got my rounds loaded up, and we're ready to go to the range. Let's talk about that range session just for a second. If you're new to the channel, or if you just haven't caught on to this, I do a lot of editing in the range footage. This is going to be a very short few minutes is all you're going to see of about 50 shots. Know that I'm not shooting anywhere near that fast. I do have a nice thick bowl barrel on this 223, and the 223 isn't particularly hot. Nonetheless, I'm going to take my time. I'll fire 5 shots pretty quickly, much faster than I normally do with the 308. But I'm still going to pause, and I'm going to pause with the bolt open just to help the rifle cool down. So I'll take at least a minute or a minute and a half between each of the 5 shots in each string, and I'll take a bigger break in between the 5 shots. I do have a temperature probe, so I'll make sure my barrel doesn't heat up too hot and make sure it cools all the way back down, the same for all 50 shots. I'm going to edit all that out. So you're going to see me open the bolt and you're going to see me close the bolt. Well, there's a significant amount of time in between that time period. And I'm also going to edit after I close the bolt until I actually break the trigger and fire the shot, because I do take my time and get that perfect and then ease into the trigger very slowly. So it's going to be cut up, and that is just for your sake, because it's pretty boring for 50 shots to watch me just sit there and look through the rifle, right? So just recognize this is 2.5 hours-ish, something like that is what this is going to take. It's what I expect. It's winter here, so that barrel's going to cool down really fast. In the summer, I'd probably add another hour just to cool everything down. I'm going to cram that into just a few minutes. I'll see you at the range.
I'm gonna send another. I think I pulled that one a little. Right hand Charlie.
Top right of the
I'm good with that. I'm gonna go grab one of the bench rests. On you. Yep. Dial right. On you. Send another.
That is beautiful.
But I mean, I might move. For 600. Oh, you put it in the cake form?
It still fits in my backpack.
Yeah. No, I bought the Zenith
Oh,
ones.
those are Zenith?
Yeah.
I'll just mark them as Zenith ones and then.
Spot on at 50. So we're gonna check the zero.
Back from the range, I got targets, I got data. We've got a lot to talk about. I got to tell you, this was fun. These are some incredible targets, knowing that I've got 10 different loads in each one of these targets. They just shot very well. I'm very happy with that. And I really enjoy shooting a very accurate 223, very light recoil with a fairly heavy rifle tends to add together to give me a very accurate rifle. And that's what we saw today. The precision was there, the accuracy was there for all 50 shots. It was truly a pleasure to shoot today. Let's break down each one. What I'm gonna do, I'll put these targets up, of course, probably already am. They're probably in the background. But I just put 10 shots on each one, as you guys noticed. I did something a little different in editing on that range footage, and I need your opinion on this. And there's going to be a disclaimer. I gave you my load data, and I just haven't been doing that. I've got to give you the disclaimer on this. This is the Johnny's Reloading Bench. Don't blow your face off. Don't do what I do, okay? I'm just showing you what I did. Now, most of that data, of course, came out of the book from manufacturers, but even the manufacturers don't agree. So I'm sure that I exceeded the load in somebody's book somewhere. Just know I did that. I'm very experienced at this. I know my rifle. I used Gordon's reloading tool. I trued Gordon's reloading tool previously with these powders, and I used that as another source of information. Use at your own risk. Stay on the book is my advice, but I am going to show you what I actually did. So I gave you that information. If you like that and you want to see that in the future, you'll get this disclaimer. Tell me in the comments. Leave something down there about that. And the other thing that I did that I haven't done prior to this is I gave you the velocity after each shot. I'm going to give you the velocities anyway. I always do. But if you like that, once again, give me some encouragement. It does take time to take those extra editing steps and get all that data together before I edit. Let me know that you liked it, and I'll continue. If you don't, then I'll just skip it. So let's get on to the targets. Obviously, I've got 10 shots in each one of these targets, and you saw them in the video. They're pretty good groups. And if you look at this in person, it's always nice to look at this in person. I've blown it up 500 times, on the screen. They're pretty decent groups, all of them. They look pretty fantastic. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through each load, each gunpowder, and talk about what I was looking for, what I saw, and what I think that means. All right. So let's start with number one. Let's start with N140. And this is the order I shot them in. It was just random order. It doesn't really matter. But I picked N140 as my first one. And if we notice, I had a definite flyer here. And, I'm putting the groups up behind me as we go. Well, that one flyer just happened to be the 10th shot. It's the highest velocity of the group. And we're going to see that throughout the day, that there was on one end or the other, I had one shot or two that just weren't in the group with the rest of them. That's useful information. That's one of the things we wanted to glean from this. I need to stay away from that velocity when I'm picking my final load, because it's not going to print exactly where the others are. It's going to give me that, quote, finicky load, that Tim at Little Grove Crenworks calls it. I love that line. Thank you, Tim. Finicky. We don't want a finicky load. So if my shots are going to separate, I don't want that velocity. Well, this is one of the things that these 10-shot groups are showing us, is where that's going to happen. Now, if I'm developing this load in the middle of summer, the one right below that may be my max load. But if I'm not, and I'm not, it's a little cooler outside, I need to stay away from that by a couple rungs to be sure that when I am shooting that in the middle of the summer, I don't get into that higher velocity and cause that round to separate and be in that group shift in that condition. So that's, we saw that right away with N140. The group itself, yeah, without that one shot, they're all touching except one more. Really tight group, really happy with that. So I'm putting up the target data with the MOA. The MOA is really what we're paying attention to on this particular exercise. And I'm gonna have the 10-shot information, and I'm gonna throw that flyer out because I'm not gonna use that load. It showed me that one's a no-go. So number 10, my highest velocity with N140 is out, and then I'm gonna give you the load data for the 9 shots that remain. So we can see what that group size is right behind me. And we can see it's not bad. So I had 1.26, something like that on the 10 shot, but when I threw that one shot out of there, I'm almost 3/4 MOA with 9-shot group of all different charges. And the goal here, or if you remember, was 3/4 MOA or smaller is what I wanted to get out of my final load. That's looking pretty promising. Let's talk about the velocity next. That's the other thing I wanted to glean from this is this a stable load or is my graph kind of wavy? And what I see on this graph is a little odd. I see 2 spikes that I really don't care for. The number 2 shot just doesn't make much sense. It printed in the middle with the rest of them, but it shows a really high velocity. I've been using this Rangecraft chronograph for quite some time, thousands of rounds. Never questioned a shot. This one, maybe, it was just an anomaly on the reading. Could have been it was just really fast, but didn't get fast enough to separate from the group. It is possible I had a problem with that load, and maybe I didn't load it exactly perfect like I thought I did. I'm not sure. I don't know what happened to shot number 2. It doesn't make sense. So I'm not going to rule out this gunpowder based on shot number 2. I'm going to shoot more of it and confirm whether that's stable right there or if we in fact are not stable. Okay, but I did have another spike at 6 that actually makes sense and followed. And that was our one shot that's not touching the group also. So it was just a little, so that's a little bit of a warning sign that I had 2 spikes in there. Like I said, shot number 2, I just kind of don't believe. But 6, I do. So I'm not crazy about that, but I'm not going to rule it out either. We're gonna continue to explore N140. The group size was pretty decent. The shots did all pretty much go through the same hole, other than a couple, 2 of those shots. 6 being right in the middle, though, is not a good sign for us. So caution, use caution here, but we will explore it a little bit farther. Okay, so the next guy up is N135. Also a really nice looking group. All the shots are touching except one. I had one that was out there, one flyer. You want to guess which one that was? That was also shot number 10 that just kind of separated. So we know that, once again, that velocity is out. We don't want to go that high. And giving the 68 degrees, 70 degrees when we were shooting this, we want to stay 1 or 2 loads under that as our final load for sure, right? This isn't going to determine that, but when we move forward, we'll keep that in mind and be sure we stay away from that. What did this group look like? Well, the 10-shot group was 0.664 MOA. It was pretty dang good, even with that, quote, flyer. The 9-shot group was half MOA. That looks fantastic. So as far as the group size goes, N135 is taking the lead at this point. Looks pretty solid. When I look at my velocities, we can see my velocities are very good and the graph is nice and smooth. That's what we actually wanted to see. I don't mind if we have a little bit of a dip in there. Some people call that the velocity node if that happens. But what I don't want to see the jagged spikes, right? That's kind of the alarm. This one looks fantastic. Graph looks great. When we get up towards the top where our flyer is, yeah, it's not perfect, but we've already discounted that we're just not going to go that high. Now, one other thing I should point out about N135, I found no load data for this load. For these 77s with N135, wasn't printed by Sierra, it wasn't printed by VV, it wasn't out there. So I had to develop this load myself. And I did use Gordon's reloading tool, GRT, and if you use that, I recommend it. It's a fantastic program. But you do need to calibrate your cartridges based on your rifle, and the database for that gunpowder probably is not perfect. So I have done that with N135 prior to this, and I applied that information to this, and I'm going to use this information to tune it to this particular rifle a little better with this exact load. I definitely don't recommend you do this, and if you do, use extreme caution as you move up through this ladder. Turns out that I got this ladder right where I wanted it. I saw no signs of overpressure. My 10th shot separated, which tells me I was getting right there where I wanted to be on that max load. So that worked out. But, you know, if you have to do that on your own, definitely want to consult somebody who's got a lot of experience. If you don't, this is not a beginner's thing that I would recommend. If you want to take my load data and apply it to yourself, see my disclaimer that I said earlier. Don't do that. It's dangerous, right? Don't do that. So I was a little nervous about sharing that information, but I needed to tell you how I'm developing this load. And especially since that one looked so fantastic, it's currently in the lead. So we're definitely going to be developing that as we go farther. And you kind of need to know how I got here. That's how I got here. So that brings us to Varget here. And if we notice, we got a flyer here. Well, actually, we have two flyers. There's actually two shots in that little group that doesn't touch everything else. And one other thing I should point out while I've got this target up is that these are a little bit more spread out than our previous groups that we've seen. We had a lot of shots literally stacking on top of each other in the same velocity range. These kind of separated a bit more through the whole range, and I had two flyers. Well, you want to guess which two that was? That was shot number 10 and shot number 9, which tells us when we got towards the top of the velocity, it started to separate. So on Varget, we've got to come down a little bit more than the other two. And we've got the room to do that. Our velocity was pretty high. We broke 2,900 on the last two shots. So we've got some space to actually do that. If we look at that velocity graph, we can see that it is nice and linear until it just kind of flattens out there on those higher velocities. So once again, we just need to stay away from the end of that. What does our group size look like with just the 8 shots? That gave us a .813 MOA group. It's not fantastic, honestly. It's not horrible. All right, 8-shot group, that's a little bigger than 3/4 MOA, but compared to the other two that we've already shot, it's definitely bigger. So I've got some concerns there with the size of the group being a little larger. Got a couple flyers, so I do have to come down significantly. I may end up with a lower velocity, and the fact that the groups were just kind of more spread out. Is not looking that great for Varget, to be honest. But if it's the best that I had, I wouldn't be terribly upset, right? But I do have better, so let's keep going. Next up, I've got 4895. 4895 is the powder that my previous load was based on, and that's the powder that is just unobtainable right now, and we don't know when it's coming back. So that's why I'm trying to develop a replacement. But we can see why I was pretty happy with that at 100 yards. They all printed in the same hole, nearly, with the exception of one flyer. You want to guess which one that was? That was shot number 10 also the highest velocity shot that I had. So if we take 10 out, I end up with a very small 9-shot group. What do those numbers look like? The 10 shot was under 3/4 MOA with the flyer. 9 shot was 0.416 MOA. It looked pretty fantastic, honestly. It looked pretty good. How did our velocities look? So the graph, the velocity graph, looks really good. Here's the downside. The speeds are fairly slow. So when I look at all 5 of my powders, we're going to see IMR 4895 was well below the other 4, significantly, like a whole nother bracket. And that's probably why I'm very happy with this load at 100 yards, but it's really not spectacular at 600 yards. It does tend to open up, not a tremendous amount. It could be better. And that's why we're trying to develop a better 600 particularly. But the 100-yard, that looks pretty good. If I was doing straight up load development and I could get 4895, it would be in. I would try it at 600. I'd go ahead and finish the load development for everything and just see what it would do at 600 and see if it held. But with that lower velocity, that is the big red flag on IMR 4895. And that leaves TAC. And I want to talk about TAC just for a second. Everybody says TAC is not temperature stable. I got a video on that temperature, what happens, and it's not as dramatic as I believed in the past until I did that test and really got to see what actually happens with TAC. Now, that being said, the other issue I tend to have with TAC is it's another really good 100-yard powder. It tends to shoot very well, very nice velocities, and in nice tight groups at 100 yards. But it seems to be a little harder to get a solid standard deviation and velocity out of it. It's just one of those powders that's just typically giving me high SDs. So I'm going to do full load development with that in mind, that it may fail when we start getting more shots on a single load and start looking at SDs. Just one of those things in the back of my mind. Yeah, maybe it won't be good enough. But let's take a look and see, does it pass today? Did it go through our initial and look pretty decent? Well, how do the 10-shot groups look? Yeah, about an MOA-ish, a little less. Not too bad, but I had a flyer. And on all my other powders, the flyers were at the very top. This is also something I've seen quite a few times with TAC. It's not. TAC seems to like to run right at the hairy edge of max velocity. It just seems to print very well there. And this flyer actually was the first shot. And if we look at that graph, I've got one other shot that's not actually touching all the rest. That was shot number 2. So TAC is responding pretty much the opposite of all the other powders. The slower speed is its problem, not the higher speed. So same thing, we're going to want to avoid that range. We'll just stay in the top of TAC, and we'll drop the bottom as we move forward. And that seems to be fairly typical for TAC. It just likes to run hot. So how hot did it run? Let's look at velocity. When I look at that graph, I can see my speeds are way up there. You know, I'm not breaking 3,000 with 77 grains, but getting there and doing that well, so I don't have to throw out those velocities. So it's going to be without a doubt the fastest velocity that we're going to end up with if we develop this load. But the other thing to note is, you know, checking this graph out, it's a whole lot less linear than the rest. It's not horrible by any stretch. And remember, these are just one shot per charge, so there's no statistical significance here. But that graph is a little more jagged than the rest. It's reasonable. Once again, if we explore that a little bit farther, it may flatten out if I shot more loads at each one of those charges, or it might not. So let's put all that together. I've got a list I'm going to put up here, and I'll move over a little bit so you can see all that. I'm going to give you the groups of every one, all 5 in MOA, and then on the right, we're going to have our mean radius as well. And we can see, if we look at that, we've got, we could call it winners and losers. We're going to pick our best 3, knowing we can't load IMR, so really we're just throwing out 1. And if we look at that, Varget really didn't do well on the mean radius or on the group sizes. So that's the one that we're going to drop. And I can't get IMR, so we're going to obviously drop that from future load development as well. That's going to leave me 3 powders that we are going to continue load development on and see which one of those merits going farther. So this video has already taken a little longer than I wished. I hoped to do all of this load development in one video, and I just rambled too much. I got too much information for you. So I am going to break this up into multiple parts. I'm going to give you what we're going to do with this data and N135, N140, and TAC as I'm moving forward through the next phase, next range trip of load development for 223. This is Old Man Taylor. I appreciate you hanging through this video. Thank you very much. And I don't know. And